Happy Tuesday, everybody. We are back here with another edition of First Down South. It's March Madness time. We've got lots going on, lots of fun stuff to talk about this week. And joining me to do that, one of my regular co-hosts here, John Talty, but a special guest joining us this week as Matt Zenitz is out. And we are welcoming in with us in the third seat, Michael Casagrande from AL.com, friend of the show, an Alabama beat writer. So, Michael, you're getting the chance to do something you haven't gotten to do too many times in your time on the beat at Alabama, which is covering Alabama in the NCAA tournament. So, are you excited about this opportunity? I guess to finally be on the coverage side of one of these instead of watching from home.
Yes, I am.
So we've definitely made a wise choice with our verbose co-host.
I already regret this.
But let's dive into the tournament really, because we talk about the entire SEC here on First Down South, and it's a pretty good year for the SEC when it comes to the NCAA tournament. 6 teams from the league have made the field, including several of them in pretty good, pretty high seeds. Alabama, the SEC champion both in the regular season and the SEC tournament, winding up with a 2 seed. We've got Arkansas in there at a 3 seed. So a lot of teams that have some pretty high expectations coming into this tournament. John, just to start us off, what do you feel like the perception of the league is overall this year after this basketball season?
I feel like it's pretty strong. I think especially, without, some of the key teams that have made up the SEC's reputation in the past, notably, Kentucky not even making the NCAA tournament. There's some real strong teams, I think, at the top. Alabama and Arkansas are the ones that get the most attention. But I think, there's strength, through the league. I think LSU, you saw how they competed in that SEC championship game, that, they're a really tough team. They're really tough out. And I was a little surprised, honestly, that they were an 8 seed. Would have thought they were a little bit higher than that. Even I think flipping them with Florida would have made a bit more sense. And I'm sure they're not thrilled about being an 8 seed and having to play potentially a number 1 team in Michigan in their second round. But overall, I think it's been a strong year. And I think we've talked about this in the past, but there was a time, I guess it was 5-6 years ago, where I think the SEC only had 3 or 4 teams make it, and they then prioritized, going forward. It started with Mike Slive and then Greg Sankey. We need to care more about basketball. We need to invest more in basketball. This is something that we should take seriously, and not just put everything into football. You've seen a lot more, talented, well-established coaches come into the league, and I think it continues to pay off, at the end of the season with, these NCAA tournament bids.
And obviously, Alabama right now has the highest expectations of anybody in the SEC going into this tournament, but that's pretty new. This feels pretty out of nowhere for Alabama. Michael, you spend a lot of time interacting with that fan base on Twitter, and you're in communication with the people within the program too. So my question to you is, what do you feel like is the expectation level for this Alabama team, just in terms of the fan base, at least? This is not a fan base that has come to expect, we should be making the Sweet 16 every year. We should be pushing for Final Fours. What do you think is the realistic expectation for this tournament?
And I was thinking about that just yesterday when I was working on a story. But what would be good? What would be the acceptable outcome for this tournament? Because it's such a different beast in college football, where you've kind of done all your work on the front end, and the postseason's a short run, 2 games at the most. So I would say, a failure would be to not make it out of the first weekend, to lose in that first or second round game would be it would be seen as a failure. You get into that Sweet 16, Elite 8, those are rounds that Alabama doesn't, they haven't been there in 16, 17 years. And they've only been to the Elite 8 once. So I think, making it there to that point wouldn't be considered a failure. Making to the Final Four would obviously be historic. And most likely waiting on the other end of that, if they were to be there, would be Gonzaga, undefeated, the number one team all country all year pretty much. So, I think that if they can get to that point, if they can get to the Elite Eight, I don't think that would be considered a failure if they were to lose, because it's so hard to, it's known as the failure machine, that everyone ends up, only one team out of 68 can truly feel like they've succeeded. It's not like bowl season where you can win a bowl, even though you didn't have the best season, you can win a bowl game and feel like there's some momentum coming out of it. That just about everybody, all but one, will come out of it with a loss. So, what point are they going to feel like they've taken that step to further the program? I think they've already taken huge steps this season to overcome some of the stigmas of this program, that they can't win, close games. They can't win in February into March. Winning a tournament, SEC for the first time since '91, they kind of got that one off their back. So I think they're checking boxes right now, and it's going to be interesting to see like what would be the legacy of this team if they were to not make it out of the first weekend. But I think safely into that second weekend, I think you're feeling more like this is a success in building for what they think is for the future.
And I think that's certainly a very reasonable way to look at it. I've lived in the state of Alabama for most of my life. I have covered both Alabama and Auburn, and I know that these teams don't exist in a vacuum. Nothing either of these programs do is judged without at least keeping one eye on what's happening on the other side of the state. And I do wonder, to both of you, how much these expectations for this team are going to be affected by the fact that everybody here is aware that Auburn went to the Final Four a couple of years ago. So even though, Michael, you're absolutely right, it would be, in terms of relative to the whole history of this program, making it to the Elite Eight would be a huge deal for this program and a sign of real progress. But falling short at that point, every Alabama fan has a thing in his head saying, Auburn made it to the Final Four a couple of years ago. And I do wonder maybe if that's going to be playing into the judgment of how Alabama is doing, if that's sort of part of the standard they're going to be held to.
Yeah, I mean, you'd know better than the rest of us, Matt. But yeah, I mean, you think about when Auburn was making that Final Four run, Nate Oats was newly hired, was kind of observing the scene, getting a feel for the South, the SEC, Alabama, just being a guy who's not from the state. So, I feel like that probably left an imprint. And if you kind of compare this, I mean, you don't want to compare this to football, that Saban second year made a lot of noise, had a breakout season, didn't finish the season necessarily the way they wanted to. Kind of, SEC championship game. Obviously, they were right there on the cusp of possibly taking to that next level. But it was the year after that where they were really able to finish the deal, that they kind of got their feet wet, got a feel for what it takes to get to that top echelon. And it was year 3 where they actually won a championship. Not saying that year 3 Nate Oats championship hang the banner, but sometimes it kind of takes a little bit of practice to get a feel, especially for the NCAA tournament. It's such a unique beast that you kind of have to have some experience of knowing how to navigate that and the feel for it.
And another thing that comes along with having a very sudden rise as a program is your coach is going to get some talk for some of the big jobs around the country. And we're already starting to see that happen, John. I know you do a lot of reporting on the coaching front. What's the chatter been like so far? I mean, I know Alabama just signed Nate Oats to a new pretty big contract, but it doesn't seem like it stopped other fan bases from pointing their finger at Nate Oats and saying that's the guy we want.
If Nate Oats hadn't signed, that extension, and again, we're assuming that he has signed it. I don't know if that's, I guess it's possible that the contract's not finalized yet, but I think we're under the impression that it will be. I think he would probably be the hottest name this cycle, and so you give Greg Byrne credit for kind of maybe seeing that. I'm sure Nate Oats' agent probably told Greg Byrne, hey, there's going to be a market for me. Why don't we, for everybody's best interest, let's reach a deal now so, he doesn't go to market. Because I think, and I think Michael and I were talking about this off air the other day, like Nate Oats to Indiana would have made a lot of sense. It's, he's a Midwest guy. He's plays a fun style of basketball. They need, winner in there coming off an SEC championship. Like that would have been like, all right, back up the brink truck for this guy and let's get him to Indiana. But they're paying Archie Miller a $10 million buyout. Nate Oats will have a $12.5 million buyout. It's a lot of money for one program before you even pay him, which would require a big bump up again. So I think he is locked in for Alabama for at least take a couple of years. And I think he's kind of positioned himself that he's only going to leave for probably a truly elite job at this point. There's going to be a lot of people interested in him, but I think unless it's one of those 5, or so best jobs in college basketball, I don't really see him leaving. Again, assuming this trajectory that he's currently on.
Well, we'll see how that plays out and how the postseason factors into where Alabama and where Nate Oats end up in the pecking order going forward in college basketball, and particularly in the SEC. Before we move on, any other games around the NCAA tournament involving those SEC teams that look particularly compelling? Is there a must watch if you could only pick one of those games involving SEC teams in the first weekend?
No.
I think Alabama-Iona is a really interesting game. You don't often get to see, a guy from a little school like Iona where I think, you don't even – half the people probably don't even know where Iona is being coached by Rick Pitino. To me, that's an exciting matchup. Outside of the SEC, but if you're an Alabama fan, you probably want to watch Maryland UConn because you're going to get one or the other. And I think, I think both of those could be interesting games, for Alabama in round 2.
And LSU, that second round potential matchup with Michigan would be an interesting game with Michigan without one of their best players, their second leading scorer. LSU is one of those 8 teams, those eight seed teams. It's one of those dangerous teams against a team, a 1 seed in Michigan that's limping a little bit without a top scorer. So that could be an interesting matchup.
And clearly playing pretty well right now. They made it all the way to the SEC tournament championship and gave Alabama, 40 minutes of difficulty there. So, yeah, definitely.
I think everybody loves the 5-12, and so I think people are going to want to pick Oregon State over Tennessee, but I'm not buying it. I don't think Oregon State is good. They fluked through the Pac-12. I don't think it's that good of a team, and so again, we all get sucked into wanting to pick that 12-5. I don't think that's the 12-5 you pick this year.
There's your bracket advice to everybody from John Talty there. All right. Well, we will certainly have tons of coverage of the NCAA tournament this weekend over at AL.com, and we'll have live pre- and post-game shows for you on Saturday as we get you ready for Alabama versus Iona. Let's move on from basketball for a minute and
let's talk some football.
Have a little bit of fun on the football side. Some programs around the SEC are just starting up spring practice right now. We're not getting much of a close look at any of that. So instead of digging into stuff that we can't see and can't talk about to you firsthand, we're going to go into some fun what-if scenarios from the last couple decades of college football. We decided, this was John Talty's idea, we decided to take a look at some key moments in SEC football history, in recent history, and decide what if things went a little bit differently, and how would that have affected things going forward. So, John, I want you to get us started because you were the one who had the initial idea here, and I want you to give me your big hypothetical what if scenario.
So, yeah, my big what if, and there's a specific question that I want to ask within this what if, but my big what if is, what if Nick Saban didn't come to Alabama in 2007? And so we all know that he was a guy they wanted. He said no. They went to other people. They went to Steve Spurrier. He said no. They thought they were getting Rich Rodriguez. He ended up pulling out. I think if I remember right, there was some Jim Grobe talk. There was some David Cupp.
It was Jim Grobe talk.
There were some random guys kind of within that. So we've all talked about, what would happen if Nick Saban didn't come and stuff like that. My question is, out of all those other guys, we know that none of them would have the success that Nick Saban's had. I think that's pretty fair to say. Would any of them have won a single national championship if any of them had come instead of Nick Saban? That's my big what if. So if Spurrier, Rich Rod, David Cutler, Jim Grove, would any of them have won a national championship at Alabama?
Yeah, I will say this. You go back and look at 2007, and my first thought is we already know Rich Rodriguez turns that job down. So who would Alabama have even gotten? Who was even available in 2007 on the market? Who are the names out there? And if you look at some other coaches that were hired in 2007, we don't know how far down the list Alabama would have gone. But a couple of names that jumped out to me on that list. One was Butch Davis, who got hired at North Carolina that year, and he was a guy that had a pretty decent pedigree. He had worked for some good coaches, and he obviously did end up having some success at other points in his career. The other name that jumps out to me is Jim Harbaugh, who was hired by Stanford in 2007. Now, I know that's kind of a weird situation because he had clout in the Bay Area. He was a beloved name out there, and it made sense for Stanford to hire him. But I wonder if Alabama would have looked that direction at a guy who, kind of similarly to Mike Shula, honestly, had this sort of NFL pedigree, was a recognizable name, and could have potentially recruited based off of that.
But you got to look at where he was.
Yeah,
I think he was a D2 San Diego.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been a pull for sure. But I think it may. I think
would have hated interacting with the Alabama family. That would not have been.
I think it would have been an extremely weird fit. I mean, I think he would have been a weird fit anywhere that wasn't California, really.
The moon.
But yeah, I mean, they would have had to go pretty far down the list, I think. I mean, if we're talking about the coach at Wake Forest was probably where they're going to look next. I mean, I think that would have been a really tough sell to Bama fans at the time.
I just love the idea of wondering what Steve Spurrier would have done at Alabama.
There was absolutely a ton of interest from Alabama into that, and that was, I don't think Steve Spurrier was completely uninterested in it.
He had just got to South Carolina, right?
I believe he was hired in 2005, because I remember that Mike Shula's quote unquote signature win came against Steve Spurrier, beating Steve Spurrier at South Carolina. But I think it was not. Look, it ultimately wasn't something he wanted to do, but it's a compelling job. You can do a lot of great things there, but I think probably a lot of coaches end up turning it down because they look at Alabama and say, in a similar way to, I think, maybe Nebraska today, you look at that job and say, it's such the expectations of the fan base are so much higher than what I think their potential is right now. I mean, I think that's a situation that a lot of coaches who feel like they have a lot of years left in them don't want to touch.
Well, they look at recruiting bases too, where they're in a pretty good area for recruiting. Where Nebraska, they were winning in the days of the corn-fed, triple option, beefy guys up front blocking for a quarterback who can run the option. Where I think that time's passed Nebraska a little bit more than where Alabama has a little bit more of a built-in advantage for being in a better recruiting zone. I think that's what Nick Saban said when he went to LSU, was he looked at the recruiting per capita of Louisiana, the state of players down there. That was why he thought that would be a good pick. So I think that's kind of more what they look at.
I to answer your question though, John, of how fast anybody else could have potentially turned it around, I do think that, and this is probably part of what made Nick Saban ultimately take the job too, is Alabama in 2007 was in a pretty good situation recruiting wise, because the state was starting to see a bumper crop in the next couple of years in terms of their recruiting talent in state. And that's a big part of what Nick Saban built those first few classes on. Was there were a lot of really good in-state players, and frankly, Auburn just wasn't recruiting lights out the way that they had in the past. I mean, Tommy Tuberville was an okay recruiter, but I think once you got past sort of the first half of that decade, he just wasn't operating at the same level. So Alabama had opportunities.
Wanting a whole other career.
That's right. but Alabama was probably going to get a lot of those guys, the Mark Barons, Julio Jones would have been tough, but I think he probably would have. They would have had a shot at him even if it wasn't Saban. But there are also just a lot of other really good in-state players that ended up becoming key guys, like Rolando McClain and Marquise Mays, that were kind of building blocks of that program. Alabama was going to be pretty good for those first few years, regardless, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that separates Saban from so many other people, and I think is the thing that Spurrier always makes fun of him for, is just how relentless of a recruiter he is. And so, I mean, Squeeze, I know we've talked about in the past, with Lance Thompson and how much, how obsessed Nick Saban was about getting Julio. Like, I don't see someone like Steve Spurrier being obsessed with getting Julio. And I saw some story recently, I think it was in The Athletic, in which he had to have like an in-home meeting with Jadeveon Clowney. And I guess he had an office party later that night. So he was trying to force them to move up the in-home visit. And they ended up getting like 10 minutes. And he was like, that's enough. I got an office party to go to. He's like the best player South Carolina's ever had. And so just like, I don't really just see him like really cranking up the recruiting intensity, even with that incredible class of guys who came through. So I think Saban obviously prioritized, we have to own this state. A lot of guys have been leaving. LSU had a lot of success in the Mobile area, really because of Saban and still had in that area. And so, somebody had to come in and really take it back. And it's hard to really imagine any of those guys potentially doing that.
I do think you go back and look at the programs that were really on the rise at that moment. LSU probably would have extended their run as being the dominant team in the league if Alabama doesn't turn into what they turn into. Obviously, we know Florida was becoming something pretty elite at that point too, and that those two probably would have battled it out instead of Alabama and Florida. All right,
Urban wouldn't have had health issues if Saban wouldn't have been causing so much stress. So
yeah, look.
Good what if right there, Michael.
External factors for sure had an effect on his well-being. So I'm gonna throw one out there next, John. Predates yours by just a little bit, and my scenario might have prevented the 2007 coaching search from ever happening. But that's my what if I want to ask about is. We know that Tim Tebow came down to deciding between Alabama and Florida during his recruitment, and from all accounts, he was very close with Mike Shula, had a good relationship with him, and really liked what he saw there. So, if Tim Tebow chooses Alabama instead of Florida, what happens from there? How much longer does it extend Mike Shula's career at Alabama?
I think he just leaves a great gift for Nick Saban. That's my initial thought. I don't know. I don't know if there was a time where you could it's like an NFL where GMs like to draft first round QBs because it feels like it buys them a couple extra years. I don't know how much that happens in college football where you can be like, hey, give me 2-3 years of this guy. Certainly Gus attached himself to Bo Nix and that didn't really work out.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And my initial thought is that Shula probably still gets fired, and it just helps, maybe even helps Alabama get going a little bit faster. But it would be interesting to see, does Florida have the level of success they end up having without him? And then you think about, I think a lot of people talk about that 2008 loss to Florida and then the 2008 loss to Utah as being the turning point for that 2009 team. And so, if you don't have that, I don't know, we can go down a million rabbit holes with that. But, I think it would certainly change the trajectory of the Alabama program.
Yeah. He would have been a freshman in Shula's final year, right?
In 2006, he was a freshman, and in fact played a little tiny bit against Alabama in Gainesville in 2006.
So you'd have to for him to be like to save Shula's job. I mean, he would have to have had like a killer freshman season as a true freshman out there, which is not impossible, but not as likely.
I mean, he basically would have it would have been between him and John Parker Wilson to win the 2006 starting quarterback job.
Yeah. Wow. So
man, that could have completely changed JPW's career.
For sure.
He wouldn't be in the radio booth.
That's right. Props to our old friend JPW, who has worked with us for many years at AL.com. Yeah. So, Michael, I want to hear your scenario that you've picked out for us here.
Well, I mean, we talked about a few. I mean, if there's a what if, I mean, you have to wonder what if Colt McCoy didn't get hurt? I mean, seriously.
We hear that one a lot for sure.
But no, I think the one that we talked about, I think that's the most fascinating, that truly is a singular moment. I mean, some of these are coaching changes. What if, this guy did this, or what if that, whatever. One play could have changed the entire history of Alabama football, and it didn't even occur in Tuscaloosa or Auburn, or didn't even involve a game that Alabama was playing in. But you go back to this 2015 Ole Miss, Arkansas, 4th and whatever, a mile, crazy lateral play for Arkansas, ends up scoring a touchdown, or I don't know what happened at the end of it. They didn't score a touchdown on that play.
They got the first, yeah.
They got the first down on a play that would have ended the game effectively, giving Ole Miss the SEC West title. Instead, they get the first down, they score, they end up winning the game, beating Ole Miss, which in the end of the season worked out to making Alabama the SEC West champion. Even with the loss to Ole Miss, wins that SEC championship, wins the semifinal, and then the national championship, beats Clemson in that first game, first round of Alabama Clemson. So it was right when, is Nick Saban washed up? Is the dynasty over? And one play in Oxford, Mississippi, kind of changed a lot of that. The trickle down from that one play is pretty significant.
For sure. I mean, I think that you can sort of. I feel like we have this conversation anytime Alabama's gone more than 1 year in a row without winning a national title, but that conversation was definitely happening in 2015. I mean, there were columns that's really the first place where you started to see columns being written about is the dynasty dead? And I think this year, probably before things really started to take off for Alabama about midseason, it felt like a fairly similar conversation. It does seem like it cycles that way for Alabama, but they've had a couple of fortunate breaks that have kind of kept things alive for them, and absolutely that play in 2015 was a hugely important one.
Yeah,
I remember watching it in the press box of Bryant Denny, and it was fascinating. People were glued to they're warming up. I don't know who they were even playing. Alabama's playing.
They were playing LSU, I think, that game, weren't they?
I think that's right.
Yeah, and there was just a lot of energy in there.
Writers there. We were all watching that game.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Michael, I think that's a great one. I mean, first off, if Ole Miss wins that game, Ole Miss fans would finally know how to get to Atlanta. So that's a massive impact just in that aspect. Might need to put a trigger warning for our Ole Miss friends and program. But no, I mean, here's the thing I'd like to ask both of you guys, because I think you're hitting at an important point, is that 2013, you lose on a kick six. That's a fluke play. People thought that was a great Alabama team, but it doesn't work out. 2014, you lose to Ohio State in the playoff. I think they probably should have won that game. They just kind of broke down the stretch. People thought, all right, Blake Sims is kind of helping them head the right path, but maybe not the perfect guy yet. And then 2015, I mean, they're messing around with Cooper Bateman and Jake Coker. So if they lose, if Ole Miss wins that game, they don't go to the SEC championship game, they don't go to the playoff. 3 years in a row with no national championship. What are fans saying about Nick Saban? I mean, people always talk about how they'll turn fast, but I've never been here where it's ever happened. would we see the fan base starting to turn on Saban at that point?
I mean, I think it takes a lot to get them to turn on Saban because there are so many other people they can turn on first.
Sure.
They can always blame it on coordinators. They can blame it on quarterbacks. I think it's a shame whenever fans do that on players, but we know we've seen it happen before. And I think especially when you look at what happened the year after that in 2016, they also didn't win. They had a great team put together, but ultimately came up short in part because, again, they kind of couldn't ever totally find their offensive identity. That was sort of a very important period for Alabama in that 2014, 15, 16 stretch where I think people were excited by what Alabama was doing on offense and by what Lane Kiffin had brought to that program. But I don't know that you would have had fans fully bought in to this change to something so dramatically different from what they were used to in the early Saban era if you don't have that 2015 title. I think it really sells the fan base on we're into this now. We like scoring 50 points a game, and we'll live with having to scrape by defensively.
And it was funny because that was a team that was like truly offensively. They scored a lot of points, but there was a lot of.
It's still pretty traditional, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you look at move ahead to the Tua era. I mean, it's that, and the difference between that and the Jake Coker era season was pretty stark, but
I think a little more wide open still, just
more,
in terms of than what we saw in like 2009.
It was a bridge in relative sense. Yes, it was. And they were 09 to 15 to 17, 18,
and that was when
a gradual move
to transition too. I think you saw that you had that kind of rash of stories of Alabama can't defend the spread and Johnny Manziel and all those guys, and you saw massive having to get guys like Rashaan Evans in there to fix it. So I think if you lose there too, it's like Saban can't figure out the spread, offense isn't there yet. I think there'll be more questions about like where is this program headed, and obviously we know it's headed in the right direction with hindsight now, but it is interesting how that 2015 championship kind of ties it all together and brings you into this new era of Alabama football.
Makes it a lot easier to keep recruiting too when you keep winning those championships. You easy to counter the opposing pitches who say things like he's washed up, he doesn't have one left in him. Tough to keep arguing that when you keep winning them every couple of years or so. Do we have any extra ones we want to throw out before we wrap up today? John, I know you had another one you wanted to mention.
Yeah, I've got two, and they both involve my alma mater. So really trying to work it in here. But here, it's just there's a weird connection. So here's the one that I think everybody has definitely been wondering for a long time. What if Bear Bryant never left Maryland? I mean, that's a big one. Would he have built a powerhouse in College Park? Some are saying yes.
Some are saying
got into a fight with
what conference was Maryland in when Bryant was there?
I don't think it was ACC yet. I don't even know if they were in one. But he got into a battle with old Curly Bird, and ended up leaving because Curly Bird, I guess, he suspended a player, and Curly Bird brought him back in against Bryant's wishes, and he bailed out. So,
man, there's a big what if right there.
And then tied to that involves Bear Bryant too. But Joe Namath was going to go to Maryland, and ultimately couldn't get admission into Maryland, and so then he goes to Alabama instead. So that's another. That's another. I mean, but he brings you had that string of Alabama quarterbacks that were incredible. If you take him out of it, you wonder if they would have had the sustained success that they did.
I mean, he was obviously a huge marketing tool for the school and for the program for many, many years. I mean, having a guy that was that level of fame and the attention that he brings to Alabama football, they arguably still have not had a player that has reached the level of sort of household name that Joe Namath did at his height.
I agree.
I got one more.
Go ahead.
It also involves my alma mater. I just wonder what happens if Eddie Jackson recovers that fumble on the flea flicker against Western Kentucky in 2016. They would have never kicked that field goal, and who knows?
Yeah, who knows? It would have
been wondering about.
It would have been a slightly closer game.
That's
Fascinating. Fascinating. Michael, congrats to your Western Kentucky Hilltoppers on a great season, on being the last team to defeat Alabama at home. Is that right?
That's correct. It did not end well in the conference tournament, so thanks for bringing up that. But
they did beat UAB much.
They did beat UAB, yeah.
2-0 against UA system schools.
a very well-known metric that all programs are judged by.
Michael, you've got a spot right behind you above your shoulder where you can hang a little mini banner in your house. 2-0 against Alabama system.
There you go.
Don't dare me.
Take that, Chancellor. All right. Well, guys, thanks for joining me for some fun hypotheticals. Michael, thank you for being our guest this week, and we will have tons of coverage for you as we get ready for spring football around the league, both at Alabama and Auburn, and obviously the NCAA tournament for Alabama this weekend. So lots of exciting stuff ahead, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week.